Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about a sort of a new product, but not so new at H2O called H2O4GPU. So I will need a show of hands. Like, does anyone even know what the product is? Like, okay, cool. So around a year, and sorry if I yawn or anything, I'm still jet lagged. So around a year ago or so, we started looking at like our core platform and our upcoming product, driverless, and we started trying to figure out what algorithms will we need in the future, or what is missing, or what should we implement on GPUs, because GPUs were becoming more and more popular. So there's a few ways to actually do it. Obviously, one of them was to ask our data scientists what they want, but also around that time, Kaggle released a poll asking data scientists which algorithms do they actually use in production. And the results were a little bit surprising because, well, in the news, deep learning was everywhere, like TensorFlow was the hot thing, while the poll was showing actually more and more use of like traditional machine learning algorithms, such as logistic regression, decision trees, and ensembles, SVM, etc., etc. So we were covered with like what we should implement. Then we were starting to think, okay, but should we expose it in C? What do the people actually use? And well, this wasn't actually very surprising. Like most people use Python, R. Jupyter Notebook is getting also more and more popular. So we were trying to create a new library that would like take all of this and like give it to the people. The other thing that I mentioned is we also were thinking whether we should re-implement it on the CPU or whether we should go with the GPUs. And the main reason we went with GPUs is because, well, as most of you probably know, Moore's law is like hitting us really hard. So even though we're getting more and more transistors in CPUs, like the performance is just not there. This isn't really true with GPUs. With GPUs, it's getting better and better with every year. Like you can check the benchmarks on NVIDIA's website, and it's getting much, much faster. Like if you compare GPUs from this year to GPUs from like 5 years ago, the performance is just mind-blowing. So we are trying to now actually port most of our implementations from H2O core to the GPUs. And one thing I get asked all the time is like, okay, so should we like use all the algorithms on the GPUs? Like, why are the GPUs actually good for machine learning? Like, what's the deal? So the whole thing started, like, the whole point of using GPUs is like the architecture. Like, GPUs and CPUs have a completely different architecture, and obviously it has like pros and cons. So CPUs are all about latency. So how I like to think about it is like you have those things, ALUs, which are arithmetic logistic units. And that's basically what does the computations, right? So CPUs have fewer of them, but they are way, way more powerful. Whereas GPUs have way more of them, but they are not as powerful. So when you start thinking about it, it means that like, okay, CPUs will be much better if there's not as many tasks, but they require more computations, or like there's like more if statements, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas GPUs will be much better if you have a whole bunch of really small, really, really simple computations. And that's really what machine learning is all about. Like, I will show an example in a moment, but basically it's all about latency and throughput. So CPUs are all about latency, GPUs are all about throughput. So how you usually use it in your applications is you write most of your code for the CPU, you try to figure out and pinpoint like which parts of the code are like really compute intensive. you grab them and you try to implement them on the GPU, and then the results get back to the CPU and you just continue with your normal workflow. So a very simple example, like this is like very basic, but when you actually check most of the machine learning algorithms, this is basically what's happening, like matrix multiplications. So math 101, right? You have one matrix, you have second matrix, and you want to multiply both of them. So what I meant by like very small operations is, for example, when you want to multiply a matrix, you will take the first row, right? And you want to multiply it by the first column, right? And that will give you the first cell in the output matrix. So this will be a whole bunch of really small multiplications and additions, right? But when you think about like your data size in machine learning, usually you have hundreds of thousands or millions or even billions of rows and probably thousands of columns, right? So there's going to be billions or trillions of such operations. So you don't really need like a very powerful computation unit for each, but you need a lot of them. So that's why GPUs are really good for this kind of operations, if you want to go column by column, etc. So taking all this together, like all those algorithms that we figured out that data scientists use and like why GPUs are good, we decided to start H2O4GPU, which is a completely open source project. It's a collection of algorithms. Currently we have GBMs, GLMs, we have Truncated SVD PCA, KMeans, and we should have in a week or two filled our factorization machines. We try to do it in a performance optimized way, which means the code isn't always very pretty, but it's fast. We support for most of our algorithms multi-GPU. We do use it in driverless AI, obviously. So it's not just, it's there and no one's using it. We're making it mainly for ourselves. And it has a Python N and R API. So you don't really need to do anything in C++ or whatever. If you use scikit-learn, if you're well versed in it, like the API is more or less compatible with it, so you shouldn't have problems. It's almost a drop-down replacement. So the first, just checking the time, we're okay. So the first algorithm that we implemented, and it's been implemented by this guy, Rory Mitchell, who's now doing a PhD in New Zealand. He's working at H2O now. Are gradient boosting machines. So this is all based on XGBoost, which from what I understand is like the most used library for Kaggle. And it's been completely written by him. There's a few estimators now being developed as additions, but from what I understand, it has all the features that the original XGBoost has. The most important part here is are the benchmarks. So this has been done, those benchmarks been done a year ago. They are now a little bit faster, but not by much. So the blue one is the CPU. Obviously, the longer is like the worse. This is all in seconds. So it was run on a double Xeon CPU versus different configurations of GPUs. The interesting part here is that we actually scale relatively okay. Obviously, you don't get like linear scaling with the number of GPUs, but it's still around 1.5 times, which is relatively good. The next algorithm we implemented was KMeans, which is a clustering algorithm. We're using the traditional Lloyd's algorithm. The initial implementation was done by NVIDIA, and we just took it, we bug fixed it, we improved performance. We added new implementation initialization methods such as KMeans++ and KMeans parallel, which improves convergence of the whole algorithm. We did quite a few benchmarks, but we didn't publish them all yet. On average, we are more or less 50 times faster than scikit-learn. It really depends on your data size. For example, if your data is really small, like let's say 10,000 rows or less, well, I wouldn't really bother with GPUs. Same with like 100. I would start using it above, let's say, 100,000 rows. This is like the second most asked question, like when should I actually use GPUs? And it's really hard to say because it depends on a few factors. First of all, like what GPUs are you using? Like if you're using a very small one or an old one like a NVIDIA K80, well, then I would probably say that you shouldn't really use it if you have really good CPUs because you're gonna be slower in most cases. It also depends on the size of your data set, so how many rows you have, but it also depends on like how wide your data set is. Like if you only have like 2 or 3 columns, then there's not gonna be that many computations actually going on, so you might still be better with sticking to CPUs. With KMeans, it also depends in like how many clusters you want to cluster the whole thing. Like if you want to cluster in only 2 clusters, then the CPU also might be faster even for relatively big data sets. But for example, I tried to benchmark 10 million rows with 1,000 columns into 1,000 clusters. With our implementation, it took us like 5 minutes. With scikit-learn, like I had to kill the job after 1 day because it was still going. One use case for KMeans is actually, I found it pretty cool because personally I didn't know you can do it. You can compress data with it. So this is a summer palace in China, and the original image is using over 96,000 colors. With KMeans, you can actually downsample it to 64 colors and still have a relatively good image. And obviously, you know, if you have like orders of magnitudes less colors, you can use way less space to actually store the whole image. So yeah, this is one of the benchmarks that we actually did and published. This is on a Kaggle dataset home site. So again, with you can see that against scikit and TensorFlow, we were like several orders of magnitude faster, even with only 1 GPU. Then we implemented Truncated SVD and PCA. This is the only algorithm that is actually not multi-GPU supported. So it's all on a single GPU. That's because matrix decomposition is really hard on multi-GPU, but we're researching it, so we might come up with something shortly. So for people who are not really well-versed with this, it's a way to decompose matrices, and it's really popular in text processing and dimensionality reduction. We're using this library called QSolver from NVIDIA to do matrix decomposition. So and please don't be scared now, one use case for this is a relatively famous Olivetti phase dataset from one of the universities, I forget which one. The biggest problem with this dataset was that those images, even if they were like small, 64 over 64 pixels, that would still give us like 4,096 features. And that was really too much for any algorithm to actually preprocess. So what the researchers figured is that we don't really need all of them because apparently most of the faces, like most of the features are like shared across everyone. So that wouldn't really give us any useful information. So what they did was they used PCA which says which features are actually the most important, because what PCA does is it tries to figure out which features have the biggest variance, and the bigger the variance, the more informative the features are, right? So they actually use only around 200 features, and this is what you get on the right side. And then you can take this downsampled data set and shove it into your algorithm and actually use only the useful information, but the processing will be much, much faster. So again, we did a little bit of benchmarks, and sklearn is on the right side with like the blue, and well, it should be yellow, but I guess it's pale pink, is H2O4GPU. And one thing to notice is it's really hard to see on this slide, but the last column, even though it's also like 5 million rows, the data set is much, much more skinny than the second from the right. And there, actually, sklearn is faster than even though the number of rows is the same. So that's what I was trying to say before, right? It's not only about the number of rows, it's also like the type of the data and like how many operations we will have to perform. So currently we're working on field-aware factorization machines. For people who are not, like, who haven't heard about it, it's really popular in CTR, in click-through rate problems. So if you want to figure out whether like someone who actually sees the ad will click on it, this is like the thing that most people are using nowadays. Up until recently, like logistic regression and other linear methods were being used, but they are not really good at feature conjunctions, which means like they don't really find like all the intrinsic dependencies between features. Like basically every feature is just being used independently, which is obviously not good, right? So what FFM is trying to do is like they're trying to find all those dependencies between all of the features, and that's how the model is actually created. It's been used to actually win a few really high-profile competitions on Kaggle, so that's something our data scientists are really, really looking forward to. That's why we're trying to implement it nowadays. If you want like more information, like I know this is really hard to read, but those are links anyway, so the slides will be probably online. You can check all the code on GitHub. We are like completely open source, so if you're like into CUDA programming or into C++, we have a whole bunch of issues. Just go there and do a PR. For questions, we use Stack Overflow, or you can find us on Gitter. And I think that's it. Do you have any questions? No, so I mean, yes, so the implementation is C++, but basically what we give you is a Python wheel. So you just do pip install H2O4GPU, and that's it. The only requirement is that like you need, for the GPU version, you need to have CUDA installed, and you need to have OpenBLAS, and that's it. And then you just can do it from Python console as usual. Just import H2O4GPU, and that's it. No, so for scoring, you can just do a pickle. We don't really, for now, we don't really need anything like more. You just like pickle the thing, and you can unpickle it wherever you want and just do a predict, and that's it. So for GLM, we already have a method that actually grabs a pointer to memory on GPUs, But for other algorithms, we don't really have it yet. Like, we really want to, because like we're part of this Go AI initiative, and like that's the whole idea, that everything is on the GPU, but we didn't really have time to implement it yet.
So there's no, it's automatic, you don't have to be on, you don't have to implement any other options?
No, so how it works is like all the algorithms, you just pass the data that's on the CPU, like in RAM, in the host RAM, and we will automatically move it to the GPU and do all the modeling there, and like then destroy the memory, the data in the GPU memory. But for GLM, we also have a feed method that doesn't take the host RAM data. It just takes a pointer to the GPU memory and will run on it. So that one has those two options. But for the other algorithms, we didn't really have time yet to implement the pointer method. But it's somewhere on the roadmap. Any other questions? No? Okay, then we can go and hit happy hour.